Thank you for joining our fireside chat on how satellites are bringing radical data transparency to greenhouse gas emissions globally. My name is Emily Jackson. I am the SVP Sustainability at the Economist Group, and I'm joined by Gavin McCormick, co-founder and executive director at What Time, Shreya Sundarasan, co-founder and co-chief executive at Transition Zero, and Deborah Gordon, senior principal at RMI. In this fireside chat, we're going to take a closer look at how transparency and rapid reporting is required to hold countries and companies account for their emissions pledges, and how satellites, integrated models, and artificial intelligence might provide the answer. So, diving into this conversation, your organizations are part of a really unique coalition, Climate Trace, of scientists, of tech companies and activists working to address this issue. I'd like to understand, firstly, what is it that Climate Trace does, and what role does each of your organizations play as part of the coalition? So, Gavin, I'll hand over to you to answer that.
So it is a bit of an unusual organization. The answer is always changing as we're going fast. But I like to think of Climate Trace as sort of like the Wikipedia for emissions. We are a really diverse and growing number of organizations. We started with about 9, and I think we're up to 50 something now, all sharing emissions data on different sectors of the economy. So kind of the basic structure was that each of us started as organizations that is interested in reducing emissions in different sectors of the economy. So for example, my organization, What Time, works in electricity emissions. But we realized that in the modern era of big data, it would be crazy to be doing all these increasingly tech-savvy, sophisticated techniques individually, and we should instead join forces. So the concept behind Climate Trace is that different groups take lead in different sectors of the economy and different techniques for measuring emissions. We share all that in a common pot that is then available to the whole public, so that our goal is that all anthropogenic emissions from any source in any country are available online for anyone to see, monitored through a mix of things like computer vision techniques from satellites, big data scraped from websites, and direct sensors. And the idea is that anybody who's interested in reducing emissions can get access to near real-time data at as granular level as we can, validated from a bunch of sources. And we all sort of chip in where we're able to, but the results are available for all our use in the general public.
So, Shreya, maybe passing over to you, where is it that you chip in into the coalition, to pick up Gavin's word there?
Yeah, so as Gavin said, I think the real asset to Climate Trace is just having all of this different expertise coming together to create one larger inventory that's actually going to be useful at a global and sectoral level in many ways. So Transition Zero shares the responsibility for electricity with What Time, and also covers manufacturing sectors like steel, cement, pulp and paper, and aluminum. So we use various techniques to monitor emissions from these sectors and then provide them to Climate Trace.
And Deborah, you bring a lot of experience from the oil and gas industry, having built an index that looks at the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions. Is that something that you're pulling into this coalition?
Absolutely. So RMI is providing the oil and gas inputs to Climate Trace, and that although we do the whole life cycle, we leave the use of oil and gas like transport to a different group, and we're really focusing on the production, refining, and then pipeline shipping, much of the movement of oil and gas around the economy, and looking at that. And we're down at the asset level. So as Trace now goes from the country level, where we released last year, down to the resource level, where we can look at actual assets on the ground, that's something that we're looking at, that the Oil Climate Index allows us to do. And we do that through sophisticated open source modeling and also satellite data inputs that go into that. And this is the same model that's used for the low carbon fuel standard in California. So it's been around a decade, and it's been validated and peer reviewed.
So maybe coming back to this very first point about holding the emitters to account, why was there a need for this coalition? Isn't it enough to ask the polluters to report their emissions data themselves? I'll pass that to Gavin.
One of the things that I've certainly seen is there are occasional cases of emitters falsifying their own data, especially if there's a carbon tax or something. If you're asking someone whether they owe more money, or occasionally if somebody has committed a crime, that's a little bit difficult. But those cases are actually pretty rare. The far more common case is just not reporting at all. So a really common phenomenon we're starting to see as companies see that it's really good business to have low carbon footprints is offloading emitting assets to other companies that don't care and don't report their emissions. So if we had successfully actually in the real world reduced all the emissions of the companies that have reported drops in emissions, we would be in surprisingly good shape on climate change. But what we're often seeing instead is those reductions are occurring by those that are self-reporting their emissions. Those emissions are just getting moved to some other company that doesn't do any reporting. And so why we thought it was so necessary to have a coalition is moving from a worldview of kind of looking where the light is. What are the companies that are talking about reducing emissions, whether or not anything is going on anywhere else, to a world where everybody is equally held accountable in an equally transparent framework. And you can't just move the ball around. You have to actually seriously reduce emissions in order to have that show up.
Shreya.
Yeah, I just to add on to what Gavin was saying, I think a big asset of Climate Trace is enabling access to better granular and time-sensitive data, which in itself enables better data strategy in the industries that we look at. And I think this is particularly pertinent for hard-to-abate industries. Like I'll give steel as an example because that's what we work on. But up-to-date steel data is really hard to come by publicly. And as regulations and commitments around decarbonization become more stringent and pertinent, understanding this transition is really important. And if you want kind of a good example of how data helps with this transition, I think a really eye-opening one is that one steel company accounts for 10% of the entire country of Sweden's total emissions. And understanding the scale and the context of their emissions actually propelled them to advance their decarbonization goals from 2045 to 2030, so 15 years earlier than they had originally planned. And this information being transparent means that they're more motivated to invest in better technology and create steel that's being made using green hydrogen instead of coal. And that's actually what they're doing right now. So making this change is actually supposed to reduce their, I think, like 90% of the emissions associated with steel production for them. And it's actually transparent information like this that allows governments to understand and contextualize their emissions in their countries and figure out the best ways to lower them and allow for companies to take accountability for their emissions. But, all countries need the same access to not only understand and incentivize these companies, but also to come up with the right policies and incentives to allow for accelerated investment and open this up to create those markets. So I think this knowledge really not only helps create the link between companies, governments, and investors, but it also helps create more equitable access to data. For example, for poorer countries that might not be able to pinpoint their emissions at this level, but could benefit from understanding it better.
Great. We'll come back to the policy point a bit later. Deborah, you were raising your hand. You'd like to build on that point?
Yeah, just one more example. So I think the world, and Gavin's entirely right, it's not perfect on CO2, but we have a lot to learn quickly with the other greenhouse gases, especially the short-lived climate pollutants like methane. And this platform will allow us to ramp up to that very quickly. I mean, methane's complicated because a lot of leaks are not persistent. They're not just the burning of fossil fuels to make stuff. They're leaks. And they're intermittent. And we're going to get a lot of that data with the satellites that are up and more that are going up and building that into Trace. And I think that how long it's taken us to understand CO2 and to close the gap on inventories for CO2 is going to be a much shorter timeline, hopefully for the climate's sake, on methane and the other, climate pollutants.
So we started just now just talking about who's actually using this data. So I'd like to go into that a little bit more. What are some examples of perhaps governments or companies or sectors that are particularly tapping into this data now? Shreya.
Yeah, I'll give an example. I mean, at Transition Zero, we focus on financial industries, and I can give quite a good example of where I think Climate Trace is really having an impact. I think what we're solving for ultimately is comprehensive and transparent data. And that will be the foundation that financial institutions, among lots of others, will need to actually effectively communicate with these industries and provide the right type of capital to help them deliver on climate ambition. So what we found is that access to better data can actually radically improve the decision-making process along the value chain. And a really good example of that is a development bank that actually approached us that is currently using data to value their projects for around 10 billion of assets under management. And they're using countrywide averages to assess the social and environmental impact of these investments, basically with the view of investing into lower carbon emitting projects and being able to track that over time. But when we actually had a conversation with them, we found out the data that they've been using is from 2014. So they're using really outdated data to make really big movements in capital that actually have a big impact on a lot of the countries that they're investing in. And we've been working with them to see if there's a better way that we can feed in our data, which is current, not self-reported or with a significant time lag, in order to make those decisions a little bit smarter when it comes to thinking about emissions and how to value those in the investment process. That's just one example.
Gavin, you were talking about national, national level data, that how that's being leveraged by governments. Perhaps you can talk about that.
Yeah, so I mean, a great example in my mind is there are countries that haven't had an emissions inventory in 20 years. So as Shreya was mentioning, if you want to know whether a policy is successfully reducing emissions, knowing a rough estimate of what the emissions were 20 years ago just doesn't help you. And so I do think where we're at today is we've already been useful. We were able to, last year in September, release an analysis of every country in the world with recent up-to-date data, which for some countries is a major step forward. But where I think it gets really interesting is the next step. So this year we are going to be releasing much more detailed data. And one of the things we hear a lot is about 2/3 of the emissions reductions that governments worldwide need to do to hit net zero don't happen at the country level. They happen at the subnational level. So we're particularly interested in working with states and provinces around the world, and hopefully soon cities, who are for the first time trying to reduce an emissions inventory. That's interesting because you're going from 0 to 60 all in one. So the hope is to leapfrog the traditional process and go straight to high quality inventories from the beginning, and really get many more government actors off the sidelines and able to start making plans for emissions reductions.
So we've talked a little bit about the need for the coalition, who's actually using it, but I'd like to understand actually how it works and what kind of level of data granularity you're able to achieve through the satellite imagery and through the sensors and the systems that you're using. It would be great if you could use an example. I mean, just to throw one out, there was a recent report in the press about 200 so-called carbon bomb projects or oil and gas projects, each expected to release 1 billion tons of CO2 in their lifetime. Is it possible to look at each of those projects, and how regularly are you able to see how much they're emitting at any one time? If you could, I'll open that up to whoever wants to answer that one. Deborah?
Yeah, sure. I could start. Yes, so we already have been for the last almost decade here modeling different those assets, especially trying to prioritize which have the greatest climate intensity to them and identifying them, whether as they're operating or if they're prospective in terms of being able to look at the future of what's being planned. In fact, we were recently looking at this big project Vostok, which is in Siberia, up on the Arctic in Russia, and we were modeling all the leakage from the pipelines from Russia to Europe, and could see how many additional emissions will come, and even more so if the ships are going up and over the Northern Passage. So you can start to look at that. We also have modeled how much more quickly and how many emissions would have been saved if the Brent platforms had been removed a decade earlier, because they depleted and turned from oil to gas a long time ago. And now finally, the fourth of the 4 platforms is being removed by Shell in the North Sea. So we can actually pinpoint which of those assets have the greatest benefit to either be mitigated in terms of their emissions, put in CCS, do something, or don't build, or decommission, because you're putting into the atmosphere much more benefit than you're giving to society.
Gavin, are there any use cases that you can use to explain how climate trace works?
Sure. One I might say is we're really leaning to this basic notion of centralized emissions. I guess you could call them all carbon bombs in a sense. That this year, our big release that we're aiming for is to figure out the top 500 emitting assets. So a factory, a ship, a power plant in every sector of the economy all over the world. So next year, we hope to release really detailed emissions information on every asset in the world. But we're really leaning into this point about it is so common, there are 80-20 rules in this space, that a really small number of actors are causing a really significant share of emissions. And so this year we're aiming on identifying them in every sector. And the theories of change are really different in different sectors. Some examples we've seen are as varying as it turns out with ships, you can reduce their carbon footprint a lot by adjusting the speed a little bit. I would not have known that without this project. So that's kind of a very different technique you might take than, say, in power plants, where we have other work as well, but some of our work at Watt Time is adjusting the time that you use electricity or where you build new renewable energy heavily reduces emissions of these key power plants. And what I like about these kind of use cases is that in addition to just saying we should hold folks accountable, it really, data can put new solutions on the table for how exactly you might go about reducing those emissions without just driving all these companies out of business. So I think a lot of these use cases, they start by saying where are the biggest emissions, but they also put really actionable ideas on the table that often are clever things you can do with data that don't necessarily cost more.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think what's important to note is that in a lot of these sectors, companies and players are actually taking active steps to try to decarbonize their industries, while others are lagging behind when it comes to even target setting and commitments. But there actually might be valid reasons for that. Some sectors are different than others when it comes to decarbonizing. And I think what we really try to support and promote is that we believe transparently reporting on these types of sectors is actually going to propel kind of a future trajectory that would nurture the spirit of transparent reporting and help identify pain points, but also provide opportunities to engage more constructively with these types of companies to help them achieve more ambitious climate targets in general.
So is lagging behind going to be a thing of the past, though? Because governments and companies are now needing to adapt to the fact that this real-time data exists, right? Rather than using their past emissions inventory. So how are they going to have to change the way they're working, the way they're putting policies in place? Deborah?
Yeah, unfortunately, not all countries or companies, arise to the same level. So it'll be more challenging in some places. For example, Russia will be more challenging than, say, the UK or the US. And the same thing for companies. One of the biggest benefits of something like Climate Trace, which is really trying to track every asset on the ground, is not losing things as they transfer. So, at least my sector in oil and gas, there's a lot of movement of ownership. So, one company might own it over the course of a lifetime. It might be 11 or 50 companies that came and went. And in the end of the day, who's really responsible for it? So, knowing where the assets are and who, at least in real time, has control of them is going to be really important. Whereas if you just look at a corporate balance sheet, you kind of lose things because they peel off and they move to a different operator.
And Sri, are you seeing changes in behaviour in the power and manufacturing sector based on this data already, or do you expect that to come?
Yeah, so I think unlike a lot of industries, there are answers for how to decarbonize the power industry, and I think it is varied in terms of how companies are responding to that. But in terms of the narrative, the answer is out there. I think people understand that fossil fuel based power is not only more emittive, but it's also costlier, and it doesn't make sense when you look at the alternatives. So we've seen a kind of a wide variety of how quickly these companies are willing to move, but the general direction of travel is that the answer is on the table. They have to. We actually used climate trace data to launch a tool called the Coal to Clean Carbon Price Index, where we looked at the carbon price needed to incentivize a switch from coal to renewable energy and battery storage versus coal to gas in 25 countries. And we found that on average, it's now significantly cheaper to switch from coal to clean energy rather than gas. And that the cost of switching to clean energy has actually fallen 99% since 2010. So there are real incentives in place, not just by looking at emissions, but also thinking about the financial incentives in line here. And I think that's where it really comes into play that this is not just a singular actor that is going to propel this solution. It's really the link between the companies, the policies that are in place that are incentivizing this, and also the investment community and how they're going to mobilize capital to ensure that this is happening on a timeline that makes sense.
And picking up on that point on the carbon pricing, I think that's really interesting. And how do you see the solution Climate Trace helping enforce global climate pricing and trading? Because it's a problem that there's no clear solution has been found for. Is this something that can help accelerate a global carbon price? Gavin? Oh, Deborah, sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, the very first thing that these emissions data could do is allow for shadow pricing. So the industry uses shadow pricing all the time. They test what policies, whether indirect or direct pricing, will do ultimately to their own industry, willingness to pay and affordability of mitigation measures. And we can actually now create a public shadow price with the Climate Trace data. And that will allow us to really test what the prices should be, maybe different by geographies, maybe different by sectors, maybe different by subsectors. I mean, the goal isn't to price. The goal is to reduce emissions. And so we can be really smart about that.
And Gavin, just circling back to one of the points you made earlier about governments moving assets around to other organizations, but with this technology, you've still got an eye on it, so to speak. Is that going to change behavior? Is that going to, I suppose, the governments can't hide anymore, companies can't hide anymore in their behavior?
I think so. So, I mean, one of the actual inspirations for the project was voluntary corporate sustainability. So, if you think about the emitter, often they have an incentive to move the emissions. But increasingly, a lot of companies are going after greening their own supply chain. So, it was actually a group of manufacturers initially who approached me that got me thinking about a lot of this work, saying we would rather be making sure we are sourcing from cleaner sources. And so, what I think is interesting about that is it started as a shadow price and it started as voluntary corporate actors. But the difference is now you can have emissions measurements on every project. And so rather than sort of shuffling around who is selling what to who, you can actually see, are we really seeing a drop in demand for higher emitting assets and a rise in demand for cleaner assets? And I think it's a very short step from voluntary corporate sustainability doing that to governments to start think about how might you want to integrate that shadow price in a way that makes sure we don't just shuffle around the emissions, we actually reduce them.
So beyond governments, we've talked about industries that may be able to use this data. How do they access the data? Do they have to pay for it? Do they have to subscribe to it? How does the model actually work? Gavin, maybe I'll pick up where you left off there.
Yeah, I mean, it's all free online. It's interesting. We initially assumed with Climate Trace that what was going to happen is there'd be a lot of for-profit companies who would want to have something like a freemium model. And so the initial assumption was that only some data would be free. That's really not what's happened. So we've seen widespread embracing of, okay, we are going to make this fully open and free and available to everyone. So anybody can go to climatetrace.org and right now see the emissions estimates we have for any sector of the economy, every country. I think what gets really interesting is in about 6 months, that will become much more detailed of you can go in and look at individual power plants and ships and things and see not just the emissions estimates, but what you can do about it and where that came from. And that's all free and open to the public, again, just like Wikipedia.
I'm going to build on that point directly. So what is your ambition for Climate Trace? What is it that you see happening in the next 6 months, the next 1 to 2 years? Who do you want to be using this? I'd like to understand a bit more about the ambition, Deborah.
Well, I mean, Gavin might be the better one to answer writ large. I would say in the oil industry, for oil and gas, it's going to be really important. The recognition that oil and gas aren't just, say, put in cars or put in power plants, but they're put in industry as well. I think stepping back and actually seeing the big picture is really important. And then having a sense of what the most climate intensive resources are and where they're going in the economy so you can change those incentives. I think that that's going to be a really important part of this.
And Shreya, how do you see the direction of climate trace and how the data is being leveraged to take climate action?
Yeah, I think, what Climate Trace produces currently, which is country level emissions, it has already been such a benefit and important use for many people that we've interacted with. I mean, I gave some examples in the financial services industry, but this ability to incorporate country level emissions has already been such a difference from what already exists. I know that when we get down to asset level, that's really going to turbocharge allowing many different industries, but also many other countries that haven't had access to these types of inventories before, to not only see how their competitors are doing, but also understand how to shape policy and work with the companies in their countries or in their region to really make this shift meaningful. I think right now, what we're seeing in the climate space in general is that there are a lot of commitments made. They're maybe not using data when they're being made, and they might not be ambitious enough, or they're too ambitious and they're unrealistic. And actually using better data that's transparent and equitable will allow everyone to be on the same page and the same starting line, at least. And I think that sort of goes back to Gavin's point about why the initial idea of it being so transparent is important. I think this foundational data and what it's going to produce means that there's infinite possibilities in terms of what could be layered on top of it, but at least everybody should have access to this base amount of data in making these decisions.
Gavin, coming back to what Climate Trace covers and your ambition, if you could maybe just talk about where you see this growing from today to a couple of years down the line.
Yeah, so I'm the one who makes sure that we're all on track for the roadmap some days. So what we've decided to do is we are planning on releasing before COP27 this fall those 500 biggest assets in every sector. And I would say the big prize is before COP28. We have all committed to every asset in the world, every major source of greenhouse gas emissions there is, which I don't need to tell you how massive an undertaking that is. And I think after that, we do want to continue to do things like upgrade to slightly more real-time data and slightly more detailed data. But I think it's that big comprehensive inventory in about 18 months that is what we are all really shooting for. And I think the difference between that and what has been before hopefully will unlock a lot of theories of change. Everything from the ones we discussed to new ones like being able to identify some of your works, Rhea, that I think is so cool, is identifying which power plants would be cheaper to just replace them with renewable energy. So really, I think having sort of next generation climate intelligence and solutions that don't exist today on the table as part of this, it's kind of the other half of the vision in addition to the comprehensive data.
Shreya.
Yeah, and just to piggyback on Gavin's point, I think that future vision is kind of what makes the Climate Trace team as a whole so strong, because we're not just coming out and approaching this from an emissions expert position, but really from deeply understanding each sector and the way that it's moving forward and progressing. And so I think in terms of providing better analytics and data to support these industries as they decarbonize, there's kind of no better position of strength to be coming from.
Deborah?
Yeah, I was just going to add, I mean, the whole idea of this platform is you can actually chart a transition pathway. So we know what we have now, and it's all, down. It's basically a 20th century industrial economy that we have with some changes afoot. But as we really see it happening in real time and put it on trace, we're going to start to see what that transition actually means to the atmosphere, which I think is going to be the most powerful thing of all.
Well, as we are in this decade of action, I really hope that many companies and countries get on board with Climate Trace and use this data. It's going to be an invaluable tool. And that leads me to say a huge thank you to you, to Gavin, Shreya, and Deborah for this fascinating conversation. And thank you to the audience for listening in. I'd like to ask you to stay tuned for the next session and during the US Sustainability Week, which is going to be starting shortly. Thank you very much.